Shigeru Miyamoto never read about the Hittites, but his mushrooms did. In 1985, a Japanese game designer created a plumber who grows twice his size by eating fungus. Around 1200 BCE, every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed within 50 years. These two events have absolutely nothing to do with each other, except they do. And by the time you finish this video, you will never look at a super mushroom the same way again. The Bronze Age collapse is one of history's greatest mysteries. Within a single generation, the Hittite Empire vanished, Mycenaean Greece crumbled, the Egyptian New Kingdom nearly died. Cities that had stood for centuries burned to ash. Trade networks that connected 3 continents evaporated overnight, and nobody knows exactly why. We have theories, lots of them: earthquakes, famine, climate change, invasions by mysterious sea peoples whose identity scholars still argue about in increasingly heated academic papers. The truth is, probably all of these things happening at once, creating a cascading system failure that no single kingdom could survive. But here is the part historians rarely discuss. What happened after the collapse was arguably more important than the collapse itself. Because civilizations did not simply end, they respawned, they powered up. They came back different, stronger, and with entirely new mechanics for surviving their world. And that pattern of collapse, power-up, and comeback is exactly what Shigeru Miyamoto accidentally encoded into Super Mario Bros., not because he studied ancient history, but because the pattern is so fundamental to human experience that it shows up everywhere, from Bronze Age palace economies to 8-bit video games. The Bronze Age was basically a multiplayer server that got taken offline. To understand why the Bronze Age collapse matters, you need to understand how interconnected the ancient world actually was. This was not a collection of isolated kingdoms doing their own thing. This was a globalized economy, with international trade, diplomatic marriages, and complex supply chains. Around 1400 BCE, the major powers were sending each other gifts, complaints, and passive-aggressive letters that scholars now call the Amarna correspondence. The Hittites controlled Anatolia and parts of Syria. Egypt dominated the Nile and had its fingers in Canaan. Mycenaean Greeks were building palace complexes and trading across the Aegean. The Assyrians and Babylonians were running Mesopotamia. Cyprus was the Silicon Valley of bronze production because it had copper, and tin was being imported from as far away as Afghanistan and possibly Britain. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was relatively common, but tin was rare. The entire technological foundation of these civilizations depended on maintaining trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. If anything disrupted those routes, entire kingdoms could not make weapons, tools, or the prestige goods that kept their political systems functioning. This is important. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were not market economies. They were command economies where the palace controlled production, distribution, and trade. Everything flowed through centralized bureaucracies. This made them incredibly efficient when things were stable. It also made them catastrophically fragile when things were not. The system worked great for about 400 years. Then, around 1200 BCE, it stopped working. Every major palace complex was destroyed within a 50-year window. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned and abandoned. Mycenae fell. Ugarit, one of the major trading hubs, was destroyed so thoroughly that its destruction layer is now a standard reference point in archaeology. The game server went offline. And unlike modern games, there was no customer support to bring it back up. We have actual letters from this period, desperate messages from kings asking their allies for help. A tablet found at Ugarit, written sometime around 1185 BCE, contains a frantic message from the king of Wallachia asking for military assistance. The response never came. Another tablet, apparently never even sent, describes enemy ships spotted offshore. The scribe who wrote it was probably dead within weeks. Archaeologists found these tablets in the destruction layer, preserved by the same fire that killed everyone who could have read them. The Sea Peoples were the worst DLC nobody asked for. Among the many things that went wrong around 1200 BCE, the Sea Peoples stand out as the most mysterious. Egyptian records describe waves of invaders arriving by ship to attack the Nile Delta. Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them in a great naval battle around 1178 BCE. He carved detailed reliefs at Medinet Habu showing his victory, complete with depictions of the enemy ships and warriors. The problem is that nobody knows who the Sea Peoples actually were. The Egyptians gave them names: Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Scholars have spent over a century trying to match these names to known populations. The Peliset might be the Philistines, the Denyen might be Greeks, the Shekelesh might be Sicilians. Or they might be none of these things. Some scholars think the Sea Peoples were Mycenaean Greeks displaced by their own system collapse, becoming raiders out of desperation. Others think they were Anatolian populations fleeing Hittite territory. A few have suggested they were mercenaries who turned on their former employers when the paychecks stopped coming. The most likely explanation is that Sea Peoples was an Egyptian catch, all term for any foreign raiders arriving by sea, regardless of their actual origins. In other words, the Egyptians did not know who was attacking them either. They just knew ships kept showing up with angry people who wanted their stuff. What makes the Sea Peoples relevant to our absurd thesis is how they fit into the collapse pattern. They were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were a symptom of it. Systems failing in one region created desperate populations who migrated into other regions, causing those systems to fail too. It was a cascade effect, a domino run of civilizational failure. This matters because the first thing Mario does in World 1-1 is get hit by a Goomba. And what is a Goomba except a small, angry entity appearing from the edge of your screen, wanting your stuff? Recent genetic studies have added another layer to the mystery. Analysis of ancient DNA from burial sites across the eastern Mediterranean shows significant population movements during this period. People were moving, mixing, and settling in new places at rates not seen before. Whether they were fleeing collapse, causing collapse, or both, remains unclear. The genetic record shows the movement but not the motivation. Mushrooms were already sacred before Nintendo made them magical. Here is where things get genuinely weird. Mushrooms have been associated with transformation, power, and spiritual experiences across nearly every human culture. The reasons are obvious if you think about it. Mushrooms appear suddenly, sometimes overnight. They grow in darkness. Some of them kill you, some of them make you see things that are not there. Some of them are delicious. There is no obvious way to tell which is which without knowledge passed down through generations. The Rigveda, composed roughly during the late Bronze Age, contains hymns to Soma, a mysterious substance that gave warriors strength and connected priests to the divine. Scholars have argued for decades about what Soma actually was, and the mushroom hypothesis remains one of the leading candidates. The fly agaric mushroom, the red one with white spots that looks exactly like a super mushroom, has been proposed as a possible Soma ingredient. Ancient Greek mystery cults at Eleusis involved a sacred drink called kykeon, and some researchers believe it contains psychoactive fungal compound. The ceremonies promised initiates a transformative experience and the loss of fear of death. Participants included Plato, Aristotle, and basically every important Greek thinker. Whatever kykeon was, it was powerful enough to sustain a cult for nearly 2,000 years. In Siberian shamanic traditions, the fly agaric mushroom was consumed to achieve altered states and communicate with spirits. Reindeer also eat these mushrooms, which is why some scholars have suggested the flying reindeer myth originated from observing drugged-up caribou and the shamans who drank their urine to get the filtered alkaloids. History is weird. The point is that mushrooms equaling power, transformation, and transcendence is not something Nintendo invented. It is an idea older than writing itself. Miyamoto did not need to know any of this when he designed the super mushroom. He was working with an archetype so embedded in human culture that it emerged naturally from his creative process. The Bronze Age civilizations understood this. When they collapsed, the knowledge of sacred mushrooms did not disappear. It survived in folk traditions, oral histories, and the collective unconscious that Carl Jung would later try to map. That knowledge just waited, buried in human culture, until a video game designer in 1980s, Japan needed a way to explain why his character could suddenly grow bigger. Every great civilization runs on lives and continues. The real lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is not that civilizations die, it is that they reset, and the reset is where things get interesting. After the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. Written records vanished, palace economies disappeared, population levels dropped. But this was not the end of history. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The power vacuum created by the collapse allowed new societies to emerge. The Phoenicians rose to dominate Mediterranean trade, inventing the alphabet along the way. The Greeks rebuilt, eventually creating the city-states that would produce democracy, philosophy, and the foundations of Western civilization. Israel emerged as a distinct political and religious entity. The Assyrians rebuilt their empire bigger and more militaristic than before. These new civilizations were not direct continuations of what came before. They were power-ups. They took the elements that survived the collapse, combined them with new innovations, and created something stronger. The Greeks did not rebuild the Mycenaean palace economy. They created the polis, a fundamentally different political structure that distributed power differently. The Phoenicians did not try to recreate the old trade networks exactly. They built new ones with better information technology. This is the pattern that matters. Collapse is not failure. Collapse is the elimination of outdated systems that have become too rigid to adapt. The civilizations that emerge from collapse are not diminished versions of what came before. They are upgraded versions with new mechanics unlocked. In Super Mario Bros., getting hit by an enemy does not end the game immediately. If you are Big Mario, you shrink back to Small Mario. You lose your power-up, but you get a chance to continue. This is exactly how civilizations work. The Bronze Age powers shrank, they lost their power-ups. But they did not get a game over. They continued, and eventually they found new mushrooms. The super mushroom was originally just a practical solution. Shigeru Miyamoto has explained in interviews that the super mushroom was not designed to be mythologically significant. It was designed to solve a programming problem. Early versions of Mario were twice as tall, and when players got hit, they shrank down. Miyamoto thought this was unsatisfying, so he flipped it. Mario started small and grew when he got the mushroom. The mushroom was chosen because Mario was already associated with a fantasy world full of strange creatures. The development team wanted something that fit the surreal aesthetic while being instantly readable as a power-up. Mushrooms worked because they were familiar but also magical. Everyone knows what a mushroom is, but mushrooms in fairy tales grant wishes, open doors to other worlds, and transform people who eat them. What Miyamoto did not realize was that he was tapping into thousands of years of human symbolic vocabulary. The mushroom, as transformation agent, the small hero who grows mighty, the pattern of loss, persistence, and recovery. These are not video game concepts. These are human concepts that happen to map perfectly onto video game mechanics. The Bronze Age civilizations did not design their collapse. They did not plan their recovery. But the pattern that emerged from their experience is the same pattern Miyamoto encoded into Mario without knowing he was doing it. Humans have been telling this story to themselves for at least 3,000 years. The technology of storytelling has changed. The story has not. Mario starts small. He finds a mushroom, he grows. He faces challenges. Sometimes he gets hit and shrinks. Sometimes he finds another mushroom and grows again. Eventually, if he persists, he reaches the castle. The Bronze Age powers started strong. They got hit by earthquakes, famine, invaders, and systemic failure. They shrank. But the ones that survived found new power-ups and eventually built something even greater than what they had lost. The story is identical. The only difference is timescale. The one-up mushroom is literally resurrection. Let us talk about the green mushroom. In Super Mario Bros., the one-up mushroom grants an extra life. Collect enough of them, and you can fail repeatedly without consequence. This is such a standard video game mechanic that we barely think about it anymore. But consider what it actually represents. The one-up mushroom is resurrection. It is the promise that death is not final. It is the same promise that ancient mystery religions offered their initiates, and that modern religions continue to offer their followers. The Eleusinian mysteries promised that initiates would face death without fear. The one-up mushroom offers the same promise in 8-bit form. After the Bronze Age collapse, several civilizations did not merely survive. They were reborn in forms their ancestors would not have recognized. The Phoenician city-states emerged from the ashes of Canaanite civilization with a completely new cultural identity. The Greeks who built the classical world had only fragmentary memories of their Mycenaean predecessors, treating them as mythological figures rather than historical ancestors. These were not continuations. These were one-ups. The old civilization spent its last life. A new civilization respawned at the checkpoint, with the accumulated knowledge and skills of previous playthroughs, but a fresh set of lives to spend. The Israelites, emerging from the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, built their entire religious identity around stories of death and resurrection, exile and return, destruction and rebuilding. The destruction of the First Temple, the Babylonian exile, and the eventual return to rebuild became the defining narrative of Jewish history. This is a one-up story. The life was lost. A new life was gained. The game continued. Christianity later built on this foundation, with its central narrative of death and resurrection. Islam emerged from societies that had experienced their own collapses and rebuilding. The pattern is everywhere because the pattern is true. Civilizations die and resurrect. The one-up mushroom is just the video game version of a story humans have been telling since the Bronze Age ended. Levels are just civilizational stages with better graphics. Super Mario Bros. Is divided into worlds, and each world is divided into levels. World 1 has different challenges than World 8. The enemies get harder. The platforms get trickier. The skills required to succeed escalate. This is not just game design. This is a model of civilizational development. Historians divide human history into ages, precisely because societies go through stages. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age not because someone decided to change the label, but because the technology and social organization genuinely shifted. The Iron Age societies faced different challenges than their Bronze Age predecessors, just as World 3 presents different challenges than World 1. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was enabled by the collapse. Bronze required international trade networks to gather copper and tin from distant sources. Iron ore was available locally throughout the Mediterranean region. When the trade networks collapsed, bronze became impossible to produce at scale. But iron became viable precisely because it did not require the same infrastructure. This is leveling up through loss. The Bronze Age powers had an advanced technology that required a complex support system. When the support system failed, the technology became unusable. The Iron Age powers developed a different technology that was less sophisticated in some ways but more resilient. They traded peak performance for sustainability. Mario goes through the same progression. In early levels, you can run fast and take risks. In later levels, you have to be more careful, more strategic, more willing to sacrifice speed for survival. The skills that work in World 1 will get you killed in World 8. The Bronze Age strategies that worked for 400 years got entire civilizations killed when conditions changed. The civilizations that survived the collapse were the ones that learned new strategies. They stopped trying to play World 1 tactics in a World 8 environment. The Philistines are a perfect example. These were likely sea peoples who settled in coastal Canaan after being defeated by Egypt. Instead of continuing to raid, they adapted. They built cities. They developed iron technology. They became a regional power precisely because they abandoned their old tactics and learned new ones. Within a few generations, they were fighting the Israelites for control of the region. That is a serious level up from homeless raiders to established kingdom. The castle is always in another civilization. At the end of each world in Super Mario Bros., Mario reaches a castle hoping to find the princess. Instead, a toad tells him the princess is in another castle. This has become one of the most famous video game memes, a symbol of endless deferred gratification. But it is also a perfect metaphor for how civilizations chase stability. The Bronze Age powers thought they had found stability. The palace economies worked, the trade networks functioned, the diplomatic system maintained relative peace. Then the collapse came, and they discovered their princess was in another castle. The stability they thought they had achieved was not the final level. The Iron Age civilizations rebuilt and found new forms of stability. The Greeks created the polis, the Phoenicians created maritime trading empires. The Assyrians created a military state that dominated the region for centuries. Each of these solutions worked for a while. Then, each of them collapsed too. The Assyrian Empire fell. The Greek polis gave way to Macedonian conquest, which gave way to Roman conquest. The Phoenician cities were absorbed into larger empires. Each civilization reached what it thought was the final castle, only to discover the princess was somewhere else. This pattern continues to the present day. The Roman Empire fell. Medieval Europe gave way to the Renaissance, which gave way to the modern era. Each generation believes it has finally solved the puzzle of civilizational stability. Each generation discovers it was wrong. Mario never actually gets to stop playing. Even after he rescues the princess, the game offers a harder mode, and if he completes that, there is always a sequel. The game continues because the game is the point. The journey between castles is the content. The destination is just a checkpoint. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of the story. It was not even the middle. It was just the end of World 4 in a game that has no true final level. Nintendo never credited the Hittites, but they should have. So here we are at the end of this ridiculous journey, having somehow connected the fall of ancient empires to an Italian plumber eating mushrooms. The connection is absurd. It is also completely real. Shigeru Miyamoto did not design Super Mario Bros. By studying the Bronze Age collapse. He designed it by understanding, intuitively, how humans experience challenge, loss, and recovery. He understood that players need to feel powerful, then lose that power, then earn it back. He understood that the journey matters more than the destination. He understood that failure should not end the experience, but should teach and motivate. These are not video game principles. These are human principles. They were true when Mycenaean palaces burned. They were true when the Sea Peoples raided the Nile Delta. They were true when the survivors rebuilt civilization from the ashes. The Bronze Age collapse taught humanity that no system is permanent, that power can be lost and regained, that the end of one chapter is the beginning of another. These lessons embedded themselves so deeply into human culture that they emerge naturally whenever we tell stories, build worlds, or design games. The next time you grab a super mushroom and watch Mario double in size, remember this. You are participating in a ritual older than the alphabet. You are reenacting a pattern that humans have performed since the Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began. You are being small, eating something magical, and becoming big enough to face whatever comes next. The Hittites would understand. The Mycenaeans would understand. The Egyptians who barely survived the Sea Peoples would definitely understand. Turns out, humanity has been playing the same game for over 3,000 years. Nintendo just gave it better graphics. And somewhere, deep in the code of human culture, the Bronze Age collapse is still running. Every time you hit a setback and find the strength to continue, Every time you lose something important and rebuild something better, every time you eat something questionable and feel briefly invincible at a party, you are living out a pattern older than iron. The Hittites left you this inheritance. Mario just showed you how to use it. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to go apologize to a mushroom.